The Vikings raided the Iberian Peninsula for several reasons, driven by their broader motivations for expansion across Europe and beyond. These incursions into Iberia, which began in earnest with a notable raid on Seville in 844, were influenced by economic gains, strategic considerations, and the Vikings' inherent quest for new territories. The Viking raid on Seville in 844 is one of the most notable examples of Norse activity in the Iberian Peninsula. This event marked the Vikings' first significant incursion into Muslim-controlled territory in Iberia and had a lasting impact on the region. The primary lure for Viking raids on the Iberian Peninsula was the wealth that could be obtained from looting. Iberia, with its rich and prosperous Islamic cities such as Cordoba and Seville, offered plentiful spoils, including precious metals, jewels, and other valuable goods. The monasteries and churches scattered across the Christian northern kingdoms were also attractive targets due to their relative wealth and poor defenses. Additionally, the raids provided an opportunity to capture slaves, who could then be sold in various markets, including those in northern Africa and the Middle East, which were accessible via the Mediterranean routes established through Iberian ports. The Viking raids on the Iberian Peninsula were part of their wider exploratory and expansionist ventures. As the Vikings explored new territories, they tested the defenses of different regions, gauging the feasibility of future expeditions and settlements. Additionally, successful raids added to the prestige of Viking leaders back home in Scandinavia. Demonstrating success in distant and wealthy lands like those of the Iberian Peninsula enhanced a leader's reputation for bravery and capability, important traits in the politically fragmented Viking society. In 844, a Viking fleet, reportedly consisting of 80 ships, sailed up the Guadalquivir River to Seville, which was then a major city in the Emirate of Cordoba under Muslim rule. The Vikings took advantage of the element of surprise and the city's unpreparedness for such an attack. Seville was sacked, and the invaders caused considerable destruction and looted much wealth. The attack shocked the Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus, who were unaccustomed to sea-borne threats of this nature. The initial success of the Vikings in Seville was met with a robust response from the Emir of Cordoba, Abd ar-Rahman Saku. He quickly mobilized a force to counter the invaders. In the following days, the two sides clashed multiple times, with varying results. Finally, the Muslims won a major victory on 11 or the 17th of November at Taliata. According to Muslim sources, 500 to 1,000 Vikings were killed and 30 Viking ships were destroyed. The Muslims made use of Greek fire, an incendiary liquid thrown by catapults, to burn the invaders' ships. The Muslims also reported that the commanders of the Vikings were killed and at least 400 were captured, many of whom were hanged from the palm trees of Taliata. The remaining Vikings retreated to their vessels and sailed downriver, while the inhabitants of the surrounding countryside pelted them with stones. Soon, the Vikings offered to trade the plunder and prisoners they had taken in exchange for clothes, food, and unhindered downriver journey. Following this encounter, Abd ar-Rahman Saku ordered to increase militarization in the region and heightened awareness of naval defense. It also prompted changes in local military tactics and fortifications, reflecting a shift in strategic priorities to address the new Viking threat. The raid on Seville is significant not only for its immediate military and political repercussions, but also for its impact on the cultural exchanges between the Norse and the Islamic world. Although primarily raiders, the Vikings also engaged in trade with the peoples they encountered, and their attacks on Muslim Iberia opened up new routes and interactions. It is remembered as a pivotal moment when the external Norse threat catalyzed political and military reforms in the Emirate of Cordoba. Furthermore, it is an example of the Vikings' widespread influence across medieval Europe, affecting areas far from their Scandinavian homelands. Following the 844 raid on Seville, the Vikings continued to probe the Iberian Peninsula. In 859, a notable raid led by Hasstein and possibly Björn Ironside saw the Norsemen venturing beyond the coasts into the Mediterranean. They attacked the northeastern coasts, affecting areas under both Christian and Muslim rule. This raid was particularly ambitious, extending even to the shores of North Africa. In 861, a Viking fleet targeted the kingdom of Asturias, which was then under the rule of King Ordonio Pretenden. The Norse raiders, likely seeking wealth and slaves, attacked several coastal areas. The exact number of ships or warriors involved is not well documented, but such raids typically involved a fleet large enough to pose a serious threat to local populations. One of the most notable incidents during this decade was the raid of 966. The Vikings attacked Lisbon, a major city in the Muslim territory of Al-Andalus. This raid is particularly well documented because of its scale and the response it elicited. The raid prompted a strong military response from the local Muslim rulers, who were keen to prevent such breaches in the future. This incident led to a concerted effort to strengthen coastal defenses and improve military readiness against seaborne threats. The Viking activities in the 960 AS, while less celebrated than the grand voyages and settlements of earlier or contemporaneous Norse endeavors, underscore the persistent Viking ability to affect distant regions and adapt to changing geopolitical landscapes. Quite extensive evidence for minor Viking raids in Iberia continues for the early 11th century. The 12th century Chronicon Lusitanum claims Viking raids for 1008 and 1016, while the 13th century Heimskringla portrays Olaf Haraldsson, who later became King Olaf II of Norway, raiding Iberia en route to Jerusalem in 1015, striking settlements that might correspond to Castropol, Betanzos, Rivas de Sil, and Tui. Although the reliability of these narratives is questionable, a 1015 charter records Amarelo Mestalis selling land in northern Portugal to clear a debt incurred by ransoming his daughters. A great number of Vikings arrived in July and occupied the territory between the rivers Douro and Ave for 9 months. These Vikings captured my 3 daughters, called Cirili, Ermesenda, and Fakilo, and reduced me to poverty, for when they were about to sell their captives, I had no choice but to pay to Vikings a ransom of silver for them. Likewise, a few years later, the crew of a Barca de Laudomans, ship of Vikings, took the following ransom for a woman called Meitili and her daughter: a cloak, a sword, a shirt, 3 pieces of linen, a cow, and some salt. Dated in 1024, a royal charter of King Alfonso V of Leon annexed the bishopric of Tui to that of Santiago because the city had been ravaged by the gens Laodimanorum, and the local bishop and many other were captured and took afar, while other people have been sold or assassinated. Another royal charter from Oviedo and dated to 1028, possibly forged but presumably intended to be plausible, recounts how one Felix fled royal disfavor aboard Viking ships, before later returning and receiving an estate from the Queen. A royal charter of King Veremotus III of Leon, dated in 1032, narrates a recent battle of the forces of Count Rodrigo Romanese, including Norsemen allies, against a troop of Basque marauders who had occupied a stronghold in Mount Lapio near Lugo. And in 1068, Bishop Crisconius of Iria fortified Santiago, after in 1055 specifying that people could be exempt from resting on a Sunday in the event of an attack by Saracens or Vikings, indicating that he at least considered Vikings to be a threat. He also rebuilt a number of strongholds and castles, protecting the seaways into Compostela, including the Torres de Oeste and the fortress of Alanzada.